would like to welcome you to Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Economy and Planning's virtual sessions series, The Evolving Economy, programmed by Economist Impact. As the Ministry of Economy and Planning, we understand that no economy is built by a single person or entity. It requires a robust culture of collaboration and partnership, driven by economic diversity and competitiveness, and steady investment in people and ideas. Above all else, an economy needs to be able to adapt. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and geopolitical developments, we see a prime opportunity to do just that. To discuss how we will adapt, we welcome you to join us as global thought leaders convene to examine economic issues of growth, inflation, policy coordination, climate change, and digital economy. This informative series will highlight strategic prospects of economic growth and consider how to lay a foundation for success in the coming years. We look forward to welcoming you and engaging with you all.
Hello, my name is Melanie Nerona. I'm a Senior Manager of Policy and Insights at Economist Impact, and I'll be your moderator for today's virtual session, Adapting to Global Uncertainties, Decoding Economic Growth for the Next Decade. Now, this is the first session in a series called The Evolving Economy, supported by the Ministry of Economy and Planning Saudi Arabia, and programmed by Economist Impact, which over the coming months will highlight the strategic prospects that enable economic growth and diversification. It'll examine the progress made in recent years, and it'll consider how to lay a foundation for success in 2022 and beyond. Now, these considerations could not be more important in the current climate, with the ongoing pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And the effects of both of these are being felt the world over. In China, an Omicron outbreak combined with a zero-tolerance policy is really disrupting global supply chains. Europe is facing an energy crisis as sanctions on Russia threaten supplies. The global rise in energy prices is exacerbating an already inflationary environment in commodities, especially of grains and other agricultural commodities, as transporting essentials around the world is costing more. Now, against this backdrop, governments are crafting strategies to get their economies back on track, and companies are seeking new opportunities for growth. So where will the decade's economic growth come from? And how can decision makers prepare? To answer this question, we have some distinguished speakers joining us today. This session will be divided into two main segments. That's a fireside chat with the Executive Director of the International Monetary Fund and a panel discussion with three economic experts from Visa, the Middle East Institute, and Oxford Economics Middle East. So to kick off this session, I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Mahmoud Mohedin, Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund. Welcome, Dr. Mahmoud. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. Now, we just have 15 minutes with you, so I'd like to jump right into the questions. And my first question to you, Dr. Mahmoud, is that amid all of this ongoing disruption, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, how can governments plan for economic growth? What are some of the challenges they're facing as they're crafting their plans?
Well, governments around the world are facing the second perfect storm that came after the first one that confronted them amid the COVID-19 disruption back in 2020. While everybody was hoping for recovery, we got a couple of supply shocks, one through the new variant, and then through the implications of the war in the Ukraine. While there is a great deal of human suffering because of war, and there was and still the human suffering because of COVID-19, with death cases, with casualties, and with disruption of lives and livelihoods, we are hoping really to see the days of building back better realized. Then you get the war in the Ukraine with very serious implications in at least three fronts. Directly and indirectly, countries are being affected by the rise of commodity prices, including fuel, the rise of food, with serious implications in developing economies, the rise of food prices in advanced economies. It might be translated into threats of famine and hunger in Africa, in the Sahel area of Africa and in the Horn of Africa. And in addition to those two, we have as well the financial challenges and debt challenges. This is a very strong reminder of a similar shock to the global system back in 2007 and 2008, when we had those three F's: food, fuel, and financial crisis back in 2007, 2008. Like to add to those three a fourth F, which is impacting food and agriculture, which is basically the price and availability of fertilizers. The lack of fertilizers in the farming sector is affecting the productivity and availability of food. So that all gets the governments confronted with real shocks. Monetary policy has to be calibrated, fiscal policy has to be redesigned, and major structural reforms to deal with these shocks should be very much prioritized.
Absolutely. Again, a very challenging environment in which to plan and to craft strategies for growth. And I wanted to get your take on where do you think some of this economic growth will come from in the future? Are we looking at do we have to turn to technology adoptions to drive efficiency and growth? Are we looking at opportunities in the transition to sustainability? Where do you think economic growth will come from for countries around the world?
This is very much an important question and very timely, and I take it really for growth to be inclusive, for it to be green, and to be sustainable. And for that to happen, you need really to tackle the problem from three ways. First, on the sources of growth, if you take it from the macroeconomic picture, where is your growth is coming from? Is it from investment? Or is it from public and private consumption? In many countries around the world, developing economies in particular, you can really see the challenges in the three front. And what kept the momentum a bit is the public consumption, supported to some extent by increases in the commodity prices that have been exported from many developing economies. In advanced economies, you see different sources of such growth, and the public spending had been huge, as you know, from the advanced economy that spent more than 20% of their GDP to deal with the COVID implications. If you take it from the sectoral perspective and diversification, you mentioned that in your excellent introductory remarks, not all countries have the luxury to diversify. I'm calling you today from Egypt to have this discussion. The country here perhaps has some good ways in diversifying the economic sources. Agriculture, manufacturing, it has demographic base, a bit of energy resources, but more on the services. If you go to the Gulf countries, they need to do more because the natural endowments were not as generous, and they have been dependent on oil. I appreciate a great deal the efforts being undertaken in many of the GCC countries to diversify. And I see the diversification here coming in two ways. One, huge investments in human capital, infrastructure, including digitalization. And the other way of pushing the growth to be more inclusive and sustainable is through discovering the green economy and what could be offered from that. I saw examples in the UAE with huge investments in renewable energy, in greening the cities, and major projects aligned with the Paris Agreement. The same for Saudi Arabia, with great investments in opportunities related to greening the economy at large, and with possible outreach to the region with positive spillovers.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. I think those are some really interesting points on having an inclusive but sustainable growth. And you touched on the need to sort of strengthen human capital and also the opportunities in sustainability with renewable energy projects, for instance. I want to delve a little deeper into the human capital component. There's so many different shifts happening in the global labor market trends. Now, we have this story of the Great Resignation on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's still high unemployment in some markets. I want to get your thoughts, Dr. Mahmoud, on the current labor market trends.
Yes, the case of the Great Resignation is a case that could be only confined to the US, that had witnessed this kind of massive resignations. People are finding better opportunities, better flexibility in their time to be managed, and better locations to conduct their work from, in addition, perhaps, to more attractive packages, including increases in wages. If you cross the Atlantic to Europe, still advanced economies, but they do not have the same kind of a phenomenon. And the issues worldwide, after losing a great deal of job opportunities because of COVID, is basically how to make growth inclusive. And here it's basically about making the jobs associated with the growth numbers. We don't need to see, as it happened before, jobless growth. When you see the growth numbers are increasing, but the employment figures are stagnant. This is a problem that we see in many developing economies and emerging markets today. The investment in human capital, and investment in health, education, training, skills, could really be a great deal of help in a world that is becoming more dependent on technological advances and transformation through IT technologies and advances in digitalization. Without the adequate investment in the skills, there were many of those who have been qualified for some particular jobs, they might be disqualified because of the changing landscape in the labor market. The other challenge, of course, that we see is basically the kind of revisions that we're seeing in the supply chain and the globalization. This may have some serious implications on some of the job markets, while countries are trying to reallocate their resources and make some sort of security arrangements for some essential goods and commodities.
Great. Again, I think what really stood out to me from what you said there was ensure that there's no jobless growth, and that's really so important. We're doing so much research as well on how much investment that needs to go in to ensure that your workforce is prepared for tomorrow, especially against the backdrop of rapid technological adoption. I want to go. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Mohammed.
Well, if I may, as dangerous as the jobless growth issue, growthless employment is another threat, especially to developing economies. When you see out of concern and the public pressure that the public purse could be used to create artificial jobs that are not productive and not contributing to the GDP or without any kind of significant value added. This could really be used temporarily, but with dangerous implications on the stability on the job market and could be very much distortive. Best thing is to invest where the jobs could be created, matched with high productivity and decent growth.
That's a great risk that you raised there about not having jobless growth, but also not having growthless employment. And in that context, I think that's a good segue to touch a little bit more on what's happening in the Middle East as well, and to also touch on your earlier point about diversification. So I think looking at job creation, but also looking at sector diversification. What do you think governments in the Middle East, what are the strategies or the reforms that they really need to put in place to get their countries back on track for growth?
the Middle East, or the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, is very diverse, and it's better to use a kind of a case-by-case kind of treatment to this region, because it's not adequately connected and it is not adequately integrated. And what we see today, that some countries, like in the GCC, for instance, are recovering fast thanks to the increases of oil prices and the capacity to maneuver through the public finance and good discipline to support the economic policies. There are other countries that have been highly exposed to risks that are trying to do their best now to get the economies back on track. Countries in particular that suffered from fragility and conflict. And then you have countries like Morocco or Egypt, not necessarily super rich in natural endowment, but they have been doing a lot of reforms during the last few years, and they have been exposed recently to the shocks, the supply shocks that we mentioned. They have good opportunity to recover, but they need really huge investments in the three areas that we just discussed, in the infrastructure and human capital, and on the resilience front. That may require decent collaboration and cooperation with other countries in the region through investments, through trade, and through the flexibility that we see as well in the labor market. So in the MENA region, even the old way of putting two categories, oil and non-oil exporters, is not helpful anymore. I think it's the case by case, based on the merits, opportunities, and the challenges facing each country of this region.
I think that's a really good point, just about how we need to deal with these regions on a case-by-case basis. They're also different. They have different factors affecting the trajectory of their economies. So I think that makes a lot of sense, Dr. Mahmoud. We are running out of time, but I want to try to squeeze in one last question here. We talked a little bit about the transition to sustainability, and you said that renewable energy projects, for instance, is one way to go. Is financing the primary challenge there, or are the proper projects and the project details still not in place for that sustainable transition?
Managing the transition is basically about policy priorities and restructuring. So the design of policies based on science and based on knowledge and based on data is a priority. And we saw that even some advanced economies in Europe, when they mismanaged the transition, they went into traps, including scarcity of fuel mix that went with the huge prices from May to October last year, even before the new variant of COVID, Omicron, and before Ukraine. So managing the transition is really key here. And it's not just about money. Then, of course, when you need to manage the transition, phasing out through decarbonization, phasing in through renewable, here we are talking about finance. The good thing is, in the global system today, despite the challenges, we have really the resources, the financial resources in the forms of assets under management. You may have followed the announcements in Glasgow last year on the climate summit of more than $130 trillion ready in terms of assets to be invested in variety of projects in mitigation and adaptation. But the key thing is basically how to translate these assets into flows of funds and investments where it matters. And I think the two COPs that we have, the one in Egypt in November this year and next year in the United Arab Emirates, I think they will be providing great deal of opportunities, starting with Egypt, which is focusing on projects. No pledges, no claims, but invest where it matters, from these big summits to solutions in the field.
What can governments or project owners here do to ensure that some of that capital flows into these projects?
Some of the projects are adequately feasible, and they have been tested, and they could be really scaled up. And across the MENA region, from Morocco and Ouazzazate through Egypt, when you see Benban in the solar plants and many big projects in the GCC countries and other Arab countries, The technology is there, and basically it needs more scaling up. We see as well opportunities in wind. So what we can see in the energy side and the mitigation and decarbonization through renewables, we see good opportunities in waste management as well. The challenge is basically on the adaptation front. And here you need more public finance and more public support, and perhaps getting the business sector and the private sector to be in the subcontracting, or through variety of PPP schemes that could be developed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoud. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for all of your insights, emphasizing inclusive and sustainable growth, emphasizing the risks of jobless growth, but also growthless employment. So being careful about that, and all of the opportunities that COP27 and 28 will bring to this region. Thank you once again for your time. Thank you to our audience for staying tuned, but we will return in a few moments to continue the discussion. Welcome back. For those of you joining us just now, my name is Melanie Nerona. I'm a Senior Manager of Policy and Insights at Economist Impact. And next, we turn to our expert panelists to delve deeper into some of the points from my conversation with Dr. Mahmoud. So please join me in welcoming Mohammed Bardastani, CEMEA Economist and Director of Business and Economics Insight at Visa. We have Scott Livermore, Chief Economist and Managing Director at Oxford Economics Middle East. And we have Dr. Karen Young, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Economics and Energy at Middle East Institute. A warm welcome to our panelists. And over the next 40 minutes, I'm really hoping that we can touch on two main segments. So one, focusing on opportunities for economic growth. And second, how do we realize those opportunities through policy reforms, financing, tech adoption, and so on. So just to kick off this discussion, and maybe set the scene a little bit on how to get back on track. Scott, I want to come to you first. And this is a question I had for Dr. Mahmoud as well. So amid all of this disruption from the war in Ukraine and the ongoing pandemic, what are governments around the world prioritizing as they try to get their economies back on track?
Yeah, I think it's a great question to open with. And as we're entering the post-COVID era, I think what the Russia-Ukraine crisis highlights is that we're still faced with a number of challenges as the economies try to recover around the world. And these challenges impact on different economies to different degrees, and some are more short-term and some are longer-term. And I'd probably identify 5 or 6 that governments around the world and in the region here in the Middle East are grappling with. Firstly, we have inflation. And we've seen in recent days inflation going to decade highs in the US and UK. And that's going to lead to monetary policy normalization. So economies around the world are going to have to get used to higher interest rates than we've been accustomed to over the past decade. A number of countries from the US, Europe, across Asia were really quite active fiscally during the crisis, and they have to rein in that fiscal position, and policies announced or need to be announced to manage their fiscal sustainability. Although I term this the post-COVID era, there's still an ongoing health situation. COVID's not gone away. We still have to manage that with social distancing at times, dealing with outbreaks, remote working, etc., etc. And they're all kind of all key short-term challenges. And then if you think about the structure of the economy, and I'm pretty sure we'll touch on some of these later in the discussion, we have issues around supply chain management, deglobalization. So prior to the crisis, we were very much just-in-time, low-cost manufacturing. Now we're moving to more onshoring, managing risk just in case supply chains. We have rising issue and rising challenges around sustainability, particularly the environmental footprint, and that'd be a critical challenge for all economies in the world. And then as we look at the post-COVID era, how has the economy changed? What are the key sectors we need to focus on? What sectors need to be enabled in order to generate sustained growth. And as I say, most of these apply to all countries around the world. The emphasis may vary. Here in the Middle East, especially with oil around $100 a barrel, our fiscal position is relatively strong, so we're less worried about consolidation. And especially the oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, are much more focused on growth and diversification agendas and sustaining that non-oil economy growth in the post-COVID era.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Scott. I think that was a really perfect setup for this discussion, not just highlighting the challenges, the priorities for governments as well, whether it's going to be monetary policy, reining in their fiscal position, ensuring health, onshoring, and then, of course, the focus on sustainability. But I really like what you said about now the emphasis on diversification, particularly here in the Middle East. And Mohammed, I'll come to you with that question. Which industries in the Middle East do you think will see the most progress as economic diversification is underway and becomes key to growth?
Sure, great question. So one of the industries that we are quite excited about is the digital economy, because it will likely impact and touch almost every other sector and transform the way we basically do business. So according to recent research by the World Bank, adopting digital technologies in MENA can achieve 46% growth in per capita GDP over the next 3 decades. Digitization can also double the female labor force participation rate in MENA from 40 million to 80 million. And as you know, this is a major challenge in our region. And why we're excited about the digital economy? Because, the Middle East has a very young, tech-savvy population. The vast majority of region's population is under the age of 40, and the region features as one of the fastest global adopters of digital technologies. And from the past couple of years, we've seen tremendous growth in consumers and businesses shifting from physical commerce to either fully digital commerce or a hybrid mode of both physical and digital commerce. And I still think there's plenty of room for expansion going forward. And specifically within the digital economies, we think a few subsectors will stand out. So number one, data and artificial intelligence. Number two, the cloud. And number three, 5G. And if we take Saudi Arabia as an example, so in line with its Vision 2030 and its strategy to diversify the economy, Saudi is undertaking several initiatives to develop these subsectors. So on the data and AI front, the government has established the Saudi Data and AI Authority. It also introduced the National Strategy for Data and AI. On the cloud front, Saudi is working on developing the cloud infrastructure by introducing a cloud computing regulatory framework and a cloud-first policy, basically to facilitate digital transformation in the public sector, which is often a segue for the private sector to be more active on digital transformation and the digital economy. And then finally, on 5G, the GCC already scores among the top 10 globally in broadband speed and coverage. And Saudi Arabia intends to continue investing in 5G technologies with plans to boost both speed and coverage across the kingdom. So I think that's what we're mostly excited about.
That sounds really interesting, Mohammed, and I agree. I think in all of the research that we're doing as well, we're seeing the digital economy as really an engine for economic growth here. But I think the point you raised that's probably a little bit more important as well is inclusive growth, right? The ability to bring in women into the workforce and engage them in the economy and so on. So I think that will definitely be a priority for this region. So Scott mentioned something, an important point on sustainability as well as a priority for governments. And Karen, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit more about that. So what are some of the opportunities in the sustainable transition, particularly as governments in the Middle East consider low carbon energy options?
Well, thank you, Melanie, and it's great to be with you all on this panel. I would say first a comment on the idea of the energy transition. I mean, we're certainly in one, but we've been in one, right, for hundreds, if not 1,000 years. And humans have always relied on different fuel sources for heat, for cooking, for mobility, from wood to coal to steam to gas to oil. And so this part of the transition, I think, will occur as it has in the past. So it's going to be uneven. There's going to be uneven access to new technology, uneven geographic concentration of resources, and we'll see new politics coming out of that. But there's also opportunity. And so I think what's maybe different in this moment of this transition is that some hydrocarbon producers, particularly those in the Gulf, but also the United States, can really benefit from this sort of interim period, the medium part of the cycle, and particularly the role of gas, right? And so there's enormous opportunity for expansion of the transport of natural gas through pipeline or through LNG, but also using gas to create other materials. So blue hydrogen, of course, creating more ammonia, and then getting into the green hydrogen market, which we all hope and expect will be an enormous new potential sustainable transport fuel and energy source in the world. There's other opportunities we can think about in nuclear. The real advancements in small modular reactors are really incredible and could be a game changer for electrification and the supply of energy in the region. Lots of investment going into solar capacity, and of course some very bold targets in the Gulf in terms of solar power generation. I think the opportunity is also in translating these investments where we see them, particularly from traditional oil and gas producers, into a know-how and technology that can be exported, sold, and shared in the wider region across emerging markets. That's very important for hydrogen, but it's also important when we think about generally in electrification. So solar power plants will be a really big deal here, nuclear as well. And I would think of it in terms of a catchphrase of grids, rails, and flats, right? So in amplifying the potential of grid infrastructure and the ability to export electricity in clean ways, rails in terms of increasing transport and mobility through electrification, whether that's in high-speed rail and kind of the longer distance connectivity within the MENA region, but also in terms of urban environments. So the micro-mobility, I think, will be incredibly important and a very good target for investment across MENA, particularly in large cities. And then flats, what I mean by that is really in housing. So we can do a lot more in terms of sustainability and efficiency in housing. In Saudi Arabia, for example, I mean, more than a third of electricity consumption comes from consumer homes. And a lot of that is not, done in an efficient way. So we can cut back on the way that our power demand structure is really kind of segmented. So those are some ideas, I think, of opportunity in the gas business, in hydrogen, in solar, but also in the way that we think about the transfer of these tools, so the grids, the rails, the flats, but also in terms of logistics. I think that's a big kind of puzzle piece of the sustainability potential in MENA. And for some countries and some investment opportunities, this will be huge.
Great, thank you, Karen. I think, again, you've listed numerous opportunities for this region to get into in terms of that sustainable energy transition, which I think is quite exciting. So, listening to all of our panelists already, we've, talked about digital economy, we've talked about opportunities in energy as well. And Scott, I want to come back to you with a question about how now all of this affects the labor markets as well. Would we see that advanced tech automation, would that lead to an era of jobless growth? And this is something we talked about briefly with Dr. Mahmoud as well. Or would we see services expand to offset the automation that we're seeing? What are your thoughts on this, Scott?
I think the simple answer to part of the question is clearly technological change is going to have a significant impact on the labour market. I think my perspective and our perspective at Oxford Economics is it has an impact on the composition and the skills and the lifelong learning and the training that's required. So if we focus on one aspect, say robots, we undertook a study a couple of years ago that if you look at the fast-paced technological advances in automation, engineering, energy storage, AI, machine learning, this is all going to facilitate capabilities of this case robots to undertake tasks typically carried out by people. This is mostly focused on manufacturing, our study, but clearly there's parts of service sector that also happen to be kind of where robots become more important part of the workforce, if you like. And we estimate over the next decade or so, there could be, say, 20 million jobs globally displaced from manufacturing as the result of greater adoption of robots. But the rise in robots, the rise in technology will boost productivity, generate economic growth, and lead to creation, as you said, of new jobs in parts of services, in parts of yet to exist industries. And I think what's key when countries around the world and the Middle East start looking at this is thinking about the nimbleness that's needed to cope with this transition. In some respects, countries like Saudi Arabia have a significant advantage with the young population that's coming through, and they should be in a good position to accommodate and deal with technological change rather than being threatened by occupational mobility. But it does place a great emphasis on the type of education and ongoing education in order for countries to, as I say, be nimble enough to take advantage of the opportunities.
I think that's really the theme of the moment, right? Agility to respond to the changes around you, but also to prepare for what's coming ahead. And Mohammed, I want to ask you this question about future-proofing, right? How can countries, especially as technology is evolving so quickly, how can governments think about future-proofing themselves?
Yeah, great question. So I think it goes back to the point you raised. It's all about agility. So I think one thing that governments can do to future-proof themselves from all these emerging and constantly changing technologies is having a clear strategy that addresses these emerging technologies. And then not only having a clear strategy, but defining what are their strength points and trying to invest in these emerging technologies. And as I mentioned before, like as well as that Scott pointed out, you have the big data, data storage, AI, machine learning, automation, robotics, 5G, and so on. So it's a matter of the government evaluating where they are and which technologies basically fit their strengths and investing in them. And I think another factor that they can do is that they constantly revamp and reform the education sector and basically proceed with training to address gaps in the labor market whenever they arise. So I think that could also help them in terms of future-proofing, how to deal with these emerging technologies. And I think in the GCC as well, one area where we historically have been lagging other countries is in terms of the allocation of resources to research and development. So I think as we move forward and allocate more and more to research and development, that could also help governments basically deal with all these constantly changing emerging technologies.
Those are three excellent points there. Clear strategy on emerging technologies, revamping education, and investing in R&D. And I'm sure that'll be a concrete approach to future-proofing against technologies. But Karen, I want to come to you about future-proofing against energy crises. And I think the seriousness of the issues at the moment also are getting that more attention. So, Sais, how should countries think about that? Future-proofing, for instance, against supply disruptions on metals and materials, say for renewable energy technologies as well in the future.
Thanks, Melanie. Well, you're right. We will have the same sorts of issues in terms of unevenness to access and geographic concentrations of these rare earth minerals. But it's not quite the same as concentration of oil and gas. And these are materials that with investment and innovation and, investment into research and development, we can find substitutions, we can find workarounds. So for example, we may not need so much lithium to create batteries. There could be different ways to create batteries. And so that will be an important sort of prioritization of government planning, but also on the firm level of thinking about, the potential for alternate supply. Certainly, though, we're going to see the way that some countries will be, kind of closed out of access, and others will find themselves with new sorts of windfalls. And so it's the real, same sort of questions that all resource dependent and resource revenue dependent countries have been dealing with for a very, very long time, is what you do with the money and how you plan for, the kind of cyclical nature of that sort of wealth and what it does to investment cycles inside of economies. And I think there's been a lot of learning in that sense, particularly from oil and gas producers in the MENA region and the Gulf. And I think there is a sense, of course, in this windfall that it's different. And so there's more of an impetus, more of a prioritization of using this money differently to save and to plan for a future. And that's what the diversification agenda has always been about. But I think at this point in time, it's gotten new momentum.
Thank you, Karen, for that. And I think this conversation on future-proofing was a good segue into our second segment, focusing a little bit more on policy reforms. And so, Scott, I want to come to you first on this as well. What are some of the pro-growth policies that governments in the Middle East are adopting, and what should they focus on?
Well, I think, firstly, in the Middle East, it's important to have a coherent set of policies. So it's very unlikely there's going to be a silver bullet. So you need a set of policies that require the government to be active and generate demand investment. You need a set of supply side policies that attract private, domestic and foreign investment to engage in the local economies. And I think you're seeing that across the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and UAE are significant examples of where the public sector is currently trying to lead the way in developing key sectors, providing significant infrastructure. We see some of the spending around the Public Investment Fund in Saudi Arabia and how it's leading the role in achieving the goals set out in Vision 2030. But that on its own won't achieve the overall economic goals. You need the participation of the private sector. And we're also seeing some policy around there, which ease of doing business. It's reducing red tape, measures that encourage investment by key sectors, creating the right infrastructure of those sectors you want to attract so there's an attractive ecosystem. As we've seen in the UAE, visa reforms that generate an attractiveness to talent as well as money, because talent is critical here. So what governments of the region want to do is attract and retain investment and talent. And it's that comprehensive mix across the board. And I think one thing I'd like to wrap up and make about that, what's really important for the private sector is to have that clear vision, well articulated policies to achieve that vision, and a consistency in approach, so businesses can have some certainty about what's being done within the region, within countries, and then subsequently drawn in. And I don't think that's always been the case in the Middle East, but certainly what's been happening in recent years in Saudi Arabia, UAE, really just demonstrate that commitment to what they've set out and implementing policies in a consistent and credible way to achieve those goals.
Absolutely. So coherence and consistency in the set of policies, absolutely imperative. I want to build on your point about engaging the private sector. And Mohammed, I'll come to you with a question on that. How can governments promote private sector development? Are governments and the private sector coming together in a structured way? What are you seeing there?
Yeah. So, I think it's always good to have some close collaboration and regular dialogue between industry players and regulators. So this way it can help in terms of addressing some of the market needs. And just going back to the point of the digital economy, and in particularly in Saudi Arabia. So one area of success that we've seen is digital payment, and it was in partnership between the Saudi government, represented by the Saudi Central Bank, Visa, as well as the banking industry, among other industry players. And the example is, Saudi has one of the highest levels of contactless cards adoption rate in MENA. So basically, the contactless cards are the cards that you use to tap or insert your card every time you check out at a supermarket, as an example. So if we look at the contactless cards penetration rate in 2017 in Saudi Arabia, it was 4%. By 2020, it jumped to almost 94%. And this success was, thanks to several key government initiatives that enabled this. And that was the efforts were laid out and the foundation was laid out even before the pandemic. So as an example of those policies, the Saudi Central Bank made acceptance of contactless cards mandatory for all commercial activities through the POS devices, so the point of sale devices that you see usually at SMEs or at supermarkets and so on. It also, the central bank also increased the number of electronic payment terminals at SMEs. It has also rolled out digital mobile wallets. So all those policies has helped significantly in terms of laying the foundation for digital payment in the Saudi market. And from Visa's part, we've mandated all POS terminals and new cards that they must be contactless within Central Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We've also partnered with the government. And ran marketing campaigns to educate and encourage consumers and merchants to use basically digital payments. So I think this represents, an example of how collaboration and regular dialogue between the private sector and the public sector can lead to successful examples of, in this case, of improving the digital payment and the digital economy within the ecosystem.
Absolutely. I think, we've seen that a lot across this region as well, with sandboxes set up, say in the fintech space, where your startups are coming together with your regulators to slowly develop the right policies that will enable such technologies to be used. So I think that's quite an exciting development, and again shows that future mindset of governments, not just in this region, but in many countries worldwide. So that's quite an exciting prospect. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to financing. And Karen, I'll come to you with a question about financing the opportunities for tomorrow and the challenges around that in the Middle East. So how can some of the challenges be addressed, particularly in highly indebted countries?
Thanks, Melanie. I think, there are some silver linings to some of the challenges we're seeing right now in terms of real disruption in our oil and gas markets and a lot of unknowns in terms of where prices and production will be in the next 6 months or so. And some of that is this revolution in investing that we think of as kind of the ESG standard. So investments that are targeted to meet sustainable development goals, either in environmental goals or social goals or in governance. And so in the MENA region, this does mean that there is capital interested in seeking out projects, particularly in renewable energy. But these can be, projects and debt instruments that are applicable also to traditional oil and gas sectors, which have been quite starved of investment in the last few years. And so, for example, we might see a company like ADNOC issuing a green bond. When you say, well, how can that be possible? Well, it's possible if you put performance indicators or expectations that are, you're accountable for in access to that capital. So that can be in terms of doing a cleaner production of a traditional fossil fuel production. That can be in terms of the performance of the firm and a company itself in its governance, in the way that it treats its people and its employees. So there are many ways to structure access to capital which is friendly to what investors are seeking now, and to also meet broader goals in terms of our climate challenge, and in terms of, increasing who's in the workplace and the kind of access to social and economic mobility that we would like to see in the region. So that's sort of the exciting thing. The challenge is, particularly on the sovereign side, on governments, to package their needs, right? To package their needs to an investor community that can come and say, yes, we'd like to help you with this project, with this initiative, and we're going to be partners and investors on board. And so for some countries that is a technical capacity issue, just getting sort of projects to table and kind of ESG ready opportunities. And it's also going to be a larger issue, particularly across emerging markets and the MENA region, of this disparity between countries that are much more heavily indebted and have a more difficult problem in accessing and capital and in borrowing. And that's going to get more expensive. It's going to be more and more difficult, especially for countries that are dealing with not just inflationary pressure, but unstable monetary policy. You're seeing the devaluation of their currencies. For our
just
major...
a quick follow-up there.
Yeah.
Sorry, Karen, not to interrupt, but that's a great point. And would government guarantees help in those countries? Would that help to attract the right capital to those kinds of projects?
Yeah. So I mean, traditionally in what we think of as multilateral finance, we have ways to structure agreements that give support, give a sovereign guarantee, or have the backing of an international financial institution. This is sort of like what MIGA does from the World Bank. And then we have development finance institutions who are at the ready to help structure some of these projects. So there are definitely paradigms, there are models out there. And particularly in the construction of renewable power plants, there are ways to do this that can make access to borrowing and to doing large infrastructure and climate-friendly projects easier.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen, for your thoughts on that. Scott, I want to get your thoughts as well on the policies required in the region to boost foreign direct investment. Karen spoke about a little bit of capital in terms of energy projects, but maybe more broadly attracting FDI, but also promoting or encouraging private and domestic capital. Would is there a priority there as you're seeing with governments, and how do you go about it?
Yeah, well, that's a great and difficult question. I think we touched upon it earlier. I think a couple of points. I think the competition for global FDI is hotting up, and it's hotting up within the region as well, because everyone wants to have FDI as an important pillar of their growth and diversification program. And it used to be the case that race to the bottom of tax and corporation tax was the key for competitiveness and attracting FDI. Clearly, over time, and with the global minimum corporate tax, that's no longer the critical factor. And I think typically what is important for FDI is the business environment. How easy is it to access the market, 100% foreign ownership, things like that. The kind of economic infrastructure, because often FDI is not just to serve the domestic market. Clearly, if you're looking at Saudi, it's got a big domestic market, so some of it will, but it still want to reach out. So that economic infrastructure is really important, and working on that. Things related to the availability of quality labour, not just low cost, but quality labour to generate the return on investment. And I think the point I made earlier, both foreign and domestic businesses, anyone who's investing really dislikes uncertainty. So having that clear, stable, coherent approach that enables businesses to view the track the country's on, will offer that reassurance and really encourage them to seek returns. And there's plenty of returns to be made across the Middle East.
That's great. Thank you so much, Scott. I do want to we're coming close to the end of the session. I do want to keep a little bit of time for some audience questions as well. So Karen, I'll come to you with one of the audience questions. So energy and infrastructure will be key sectors for growth, diversification, and adoption of new technologies. What ESG goals are being adopted for energy and infrastructure sectors in the Middle East?
Well, I think we are seeing some kind of turnkey projects, right? Projects that are built with the platform in mind to be, completely ESG friendly. NEOM is one example of this, right? So any kind of activity in NEOM is meant to be, certifiable in a way that meets ESG criteria. And so, that's a certainly, a government mega project. This is a project that's, led by the PIF and its own kind of domestic diversification goals and investment direction. But there are lots of other ways for governments to put together projects that would meet these criteria. And so I think, we'll see more learning taking place. We're going to see more, I think, more engagement, certainly in mandates from multilateral finance institutions. I'll give you another example. There's a new project in Iraq, which is organized by the International Finance Corporation, I think about $360 million. It's a gas project, but it is about carbon capture. It's about reducing flaring. So these are things that can be helpful to existing industry, to the existing oil and gas industry, making them cleaner, making them perform better, and coming in with a mechanism to provide capital, but also to provide some sort of checks on the kind of performance that investors would like to see.
Yeah, going back, I think, to the performance indicators that you were talking about earlier as well, Karen. Scott, a question for you. How do you track reform progress? So how can governments ensure that reforms are being implemented at the required pace?
Oh, I think that almost starts before the reform. I think in order to design the right policy, you have to have the right kind of models, the right assessments to ensure that the policies are achieving your socio-economic outcomes. And from that design, then you'll get a set of KPIs, a set of outputs, whether it's for micro or macro projects, which the implementation can be benchmarked against. So it's really having a from A to Z process of appraising a policy rather than just looking ex post whether a particular reform's achieved what you was hoping it does.
Great, thank you. I'm going to squeeze in a final question here, and I'll turn to Mohammed for this one. Where should governments focus on as they're diversifying the economy? We talked a little bit about diversification in terms of the digital economy. Is there another sector you think that there will be a lot of focus on in this region?
So I think that, again, largely depends on the country that we're asking the question about, because that will depend on the economic structure and what its priorities are going forward. But one sector that we're particularly, excited about in Saudi Arabia is the, travel and tourism, because we think, there are some characteristics that make the Saudi market a unique travel market, especially here in our region. So if you look at it, Saudi is quite a vast country. It's almost 4 times the size of France. And, Saudi has a very diverse topography. So you have from deserts to pristine waters, from villages and heritage sites to virgin islands, from high mountains to vibrant urban centers and so on. And obviously the country, hosts Mecca and Medina, which positions it uniquely to benefit from the expansion of religious tourism. And I think most importantly, in my opinion, Saudi has a very large domestic tourism base at around 300 million people compared to smaller population in the neighboring countries. So we have this huge domestic tourism opportunity. And if we look back, historically speaking, Saudis used to spend between 15 to 25 billion US dollars annually on tourism abroad. If they do channel this spending domestically, this could supercharge the development of the tourism sector. And we're already seeing this, with flagship events such as the Riyadh season, the Formula One, the EPRI, and then some other concerts and entertainment events. And as Visa, we often work with governments and tourism boards to better understand the flow of tourists between different countries by looking at, where the Visa card is issued and where it's being used face to face, just to get an idea of, the tourism flows between different destinations and different countries. And what we found interesting recently is that we've been seeing increased diversity in the inflow of tourists to Saudi. So historically and traditionally, they've been visitors to Saudi. They've been coming mainly from neighboring countries or predominantly Muslim countries. But in recent months and recent years, we've been seeing an increased influx from countries as far as Australia, Canada, Austria, Switzerland, South Korea, and China. So there is certainly like a strong appeal of Saudi tourism, and I think it's here to stay. And I think it's a strong untapped opportunity going forward for the Saudi economy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this session, and what a discussion it has been. We've talked about opportunities in the digital economy, opportunities in the sustainable transition of energy, just now opportunities to expand the tourism sector in this region as well. We had fantastic insights on future-proofing for technology. So having a clear strategy on emerging technologies, investing in R&D and investing in education. On the energy side, to prevent from crises, it's to ensure that you have a source for alternative materials. And of course, importantly, attracting FDI and encouraging domestic investment as well. Probably the most important is having that coherent and consistent set of policies, but also ensuring projects have very clear performance indicators to attract international investors. I hope all of you, our panelists, enjoyed this discussion, but all of you watching as well, I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for staying tuned. Thank you to the Ministry of Economy and Planning Saudi Arabia for supporting this really important discussion series. Please do join us on May 26th for the next session in this series, which is Navigating the Digital Economy, Unlocking New Global Frontiers. Wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the day.